Toronto Star reporter Robyn Doolittle's tenure covering City Hall was not quite what she expected when the beat was dropped into her lap in 2010. 4 years later, her notepad has burst at the seams, recording the scandal that has consumed Ontario's capital city and garnered international attention. Joining us now, Robyn Doolittle, author of Crazy Town, the Rob Ford story. Nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
I think we established off the air, we've never met before.
Not formally.
Yeah, so it's good to meet you and good to have you here. Let's go back. When you first got the City Hall gig, what did you think?
Yeah, my city editor at the time called me into his office and said, I've got this great thing for you. We're gonna move you to City Hall. I was covering crime at the time, and you know, it's a little bit morbid, but it's fun. You know, you're out chasing criminals and you're sitting at crime scenes and it's very exciting.
This is on the police beat.
It's on the police beat. And I thought those days were over. And
funnily enough?
Yeah. No, I was fully prepared. I was preparing for the next several years of covering licensing and standard committee meetings, but it very quickly turned to not be the case.
So the crime background that you brought to the City Hall job actually turned out to be very helpful.
Yeah, I don't think I could have accomplished what I have in this beat, and I mean, not me alone. There's a huge team of us at the Star that are doing this, but my police reporting days not only gave me the contacts that I needed, but kind of an understanding of how the system works.
At what point did you have an inkling that you weren't going to be covering City Hall as per normal?
It kind of unfolded in stages. So Rob Ford declares in March 2010 that he wants to run for mayor, and up until then I just thought of him as this sort of very colorful, unusual politician from Etobicoke who was always getting into trouble. Once he was running for mayor, it certainly made things a lot more interesting. He was not following any of the rules. He was making everybody uncomfortable and shaking up the race. And so it was really fun to watch. And then when he won, it just seemed like this is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen before in municipal politics, maybe even in the country. But up until then, it was just sort of this interesting story about a politician who didn't fit the mold. By 2011, late 2011, I started hearing about domestic incidents at the mayor's home. It really culminated on Christmas when I got a call from a police source of mine saying that the mayor's in-laws had phoned 911 to say that Rob Ford was drunk and he was taking his children, their grandchildren, to the airport against their daughter, Renata, his wife's wishes. And that sort of started that kind of line of, okay, something's happening behind the scenes here. And then he stopped coming to work every day. That was the other big clue. That combined with photos of him buying Mickey's of vodka at the LCBO and him out in the town. And just this picture started to emerge that something was happening behind the scenes.
And clearly you're not covering politics anymore.
And yeah, I mean, that was the weird thing actually, is that you're going back and forth. So some days you're kind of covering this, or at night, I mean, when you're a reporter, you're never really off the job. So there were many times that, 10 o'clock at night, you get a call and try to head him off at certain areas or something because you hear he's in an area. But yeah, this whole other side of my beat really emerged in 2012.
Do you remember who your newspaper endorsed for councillor in the West End of Toronto back in the year 2000?
I do. I wrote about it in the book.
I know. That's
Rob Ford, it's time for a change.
What were you guys thinking? I guess you weren't at the paper then, were you? In 2000?
No. I was, I think, still in high school.
I think you've...
But, yeah.
How old are you? Am I allowed to ask that? You're young, aren't you?
29.
Are you really?
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
Okay, so
my last hurrah year, and then the big 3-0.
Gotcha.
Anyway, I won't get into that. That's a whole separate.
But your paper apparently thought he was okay once upon a time.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, Rob Ford, I think up until 2011, 2012 was maybe okay. The guy who ran for mayor in 2010 deserved to win that election. He ran the best campaign. He had the most relatable policies. He was the only one who really stayed on message and presented a vision. Maybe it was a limited vision, but a vision of what he wanted the city to be.
Stop the gravy train.
Right, stop the gravy train. He stayed on message. He was engaged in policy. He had an idea. He put forward some ideas. And when he was a councillor, I mean, we weren't talking about crack, right? Like in the book, I talk about maybe that this stuff was happening behind the scenes, but he was an effective councillor. Even his critics say he's a good city councillor.
Well, let me quote from the book. Here we go. This is quote number 1 from Crazy Town. Throughout his decade as a councillor, Rob Ford never cared what anyone at City Hall thought of him. Instead, he was out earning the admiration of his constituents. He toured subsidized housing. He gave out his cell phone number to anyone who would take it. For the first time ever, residents could get their local councillor not someone in their office on the phone. In most areas of Toronto, a councillor's assistant would take that call, forward the issue to city staff for investigation, and then the problem would get added to the heavily backlogged capital repair plan. Maybe a bureaucrat would schedule a Band-Aid solution a few months down the road, but maybe not. With Rob, they would call and he'd say, "How's next Thursday?" Then have the guy from Public Works at your door, said a staffer from Ford's council days. How much, Robyn, of that helps explain why Mayor Ford has essentially been able to break all of the conventional rules of politics without being shamed out of town?
It's entirely responsible.
Entirely.
100%. I mean, in the book, I talk about the impacts of amalgamation and how he has been very effective at stoking that urban-suburban divide. And yeah, this tension that exists after amalgamation. But really, if he wasn't a likable guy, that wouldn't resonate with people. What matters, and I think this is a big lesson and a big takeaway for politicians going forward, is that people feel like their elected officials ignore them. They feel unheard. They feel helpless when they're coming up against a problem. And Rob Ford spent a decade building Ford Nation. One of my favorite details in the book is this scene, and I recently wrote about it in The Star, is this idea that Rob Ford would come home from work every day and check his voicemail and write down all the numbers of the people who phoned him that day on a sheet of paper, and he'd phone them all back, and when he was done, he would put that sheet of paper in a legal box. And over his 10 years as a councillor, he amassed 4 legal boxes filled with, some say more, like well over 100,000 phone numbers. And that is what he used to found his voter database, which is crucial to winning elections. That's how he started off his mayoral campaign. People that he personally phoned back that had a connection to him. It was a huge head start when you think about it.
That's Ford Nation.
That's Ford Nation.
People's names in those boxes. That's Ford Nation.
And people often say, you know, I know he has problems now, but you know what? In 2004, I had this problem, and he called me back, and it just means so much to people. And I absolutely understand why it does mean something to people.
Doug Ford, his brother, also on council, was just on the program before you. And I put to him this notion that I read in your book that the Fords think of themselves as Canada's Kennedys.
Right.
And he really took umbrage at that appellation. Where did you hear somebody else refer to them that way?
Yes, I mean, in the book, I do try to avoid anonymous sources as much as possible, but in some instances when, especially individuals some of my sources are extremely close to the Ford family, and including extended members of the Ford family. And I got that information in my reporting, that they refer to themselves as the Canadian Kennedys. They consider themselves to be a dynasty. I haven't seen the segment that you filmed with Doug, and I look forward to watching it later. But yeah, I have heard Doug say that that's not true. But what is interesting to me is that when you think of what the Canadian Kennedys mean, okay, forget the wording if he's just saying that. I mean, is he saying that they don't consider themselves to be a dynasty? Because
no, he's saying they don't consider themselves to be some, descended from aristocrats in New England and patrician and all of that, which is true. They're not. Well, I mean, they're not like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when they refer to themselves as the Kennedys, and the way that I phrase it in the book is that they're saying that they are a dynasty, that they are a political family, maybe like the Trudeaus of Canada. And we're already seeing, I mean, Doug has said openly he wants to run provincially. Everyone close to him, it's not a secret. The mayor talks about it, that he wants to be premier one day. And they're already saying that maybe their nephew is going to run in that vacant city council seat. Their late father's grave says, many are called, few are chosen. They really do believe themselves to be the Canadian Kennedys.
Tell me if you ever got a good explanation for this. I asked Doug Ford this, and I'm not sure I got a great answer. A lot of times I see the mayor interviewed, his brother is sitting beside him. Peter Mansbridge, they were side by each. When CNN brought the cameras up, they were side by each all the time. Why does that happen? I don't know of that happening in any other situation I've ever seen.
It's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, in that media blitz that they did in November, December, Doug was almost always there in the background, sometimes sitting next to him, and especially when Doug doesn't say anything. Like, the one that really sticks out for me is the Mansbridge interview, but also Stephen LeDrew did an interview, and Doug's just sitting there quietly and looking at him. And I write about this in the book, it's because I won't pretend to be in Doug's head, but from what I know about them, Doug does not see his brother as the mayor per se. That's the Ford's family. He's a representative of the Ford family.
So Mayor Ford is the personification of the political will of the family.
That's what you see over and over. And when they're running for council in 2010, Doug would say to some of the staff, like, make sure that I'm mentioned in the press release, because this isn't about Rob, this is about the Ford family. And that's what you kind of see. That's the only explanation I can draw why he's always there. It's he's protecting the family brand. I don't mean to say that he doesn't think his brother's the mayor. Obviously, he knows his brother's the mayor, but it's this family brand that they have to protect.
He also said poppycock to that in our interview. He said the notion of all of us getting together as a family, and I think he said with my 80-year-old mother telling us what policies to enact and what not to enact, he thought was ridiculous.
But
what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, that they've talked openly about that. I mean, Kathy and Diane Ford had an interview after Rob admitted to smoking crack cocaine with CP24 and said, we as a family came together and the whole family was here and we discussed everything that's on the table and we discussed Rob's political future and what he was going to do. I mean, that's a silly notion that they're saying that doesn't happen.
Let me raise what, for many people, is the critical issue as it relates to Mayor Ford, and that is this notion of whether we have any business knowing what goes on in a person's private life as long as it doesn't affect their job. Many people will tell you Mayor Ford has brought in good budgetary measures. He's canceled one tax, the vehicle registration tax. He's privatized half the garbage collection in the city. He's got himself a subway for Scarborough. They say he's doing the job, so why do we care what goes on in his private life? What's the answer to that?
Well, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, and the question is if it impacts their ability to do their job. I don't want to say this as a blanket statement, because certainly there are things that you can do in your personal life that I think have an impact on your credibility in your professional life, whether it's exactly impacting day-to-day, like in terms of your attendance or something to that effect. But in general, as a journalist, I do tend to think that, you know, I'm not interested if someone's having an affair, for instance. I mean, if that's completely separate. I mean, there might be exceptions, but unless they're having an affair with someone that's going to have an impact on their job, I do think that that's a separate issue. Certainly, Rob Ford has not been the first politician who has struggled with alcohol. The difference, and it's a huge difference, is that the reason that the Star first published the story that the mayor probably had a drinking problem is that his staff said that they wanted him to go to rehab because they believed it was impacting his job.
How so?
He wasn't coming to City Hall. He would disappear for hours, days on end. He wasn't showing up for meetings with dignitaries. His own executive committee, which is like their caucus, said that they hadn't met with him in months one-on-one. They felt that they were losing control of the agenda at City Hall, because a mayor's power is really in their ability to convince people to get on board with their agenda.
It's only one vote out of 45.
He's one vote, a mayor, yeah. So it's this influence, and I don't want to say horse trading, but this idea of like we're on a team and kind of rallying that team together, and he was just completely MIA. He showed up at the Garrison Military Ball in a state completely unbecoming of a mayor and was asked to leave by one of his closest allies on council, Councillor Paul Ainsley.
Not an ally anymore.
Not an ally anymore, and I mean, Paul has come under incredible criticism for that, and I mean that took a lot of guts, I think, to not only say that, to say you need to get out of here, but also to kind of put your name to that. But yeah, this is all about Rob Ford's ability to do his job. Aside from the drinking, now let's get into the drugs. I mean, I don't think anyone can say it's a good thing for a politician to be smoking crack cocaine. We're not talking about marijuana here. We're talking about crack cocaine. And if the police search warrant information related to the investigation of Rob Ford is accurate, at least looking at the wiretaps, it looked like Rob Ford was buying crack cocaine from the Dixon City Bloods, which the police say is one of the major gun smuggling street gangs in the city.
The Ford family's position, though, is that yeah, he slipped up. He's slipped up a little bit, but he's on the straight and narrow now. What do we take that for?
I think anyone who sees the videos of the mayor that are continuing to come out know that his personal life is still out of control. And to be honest, I mean, like, let's get away from the political stuff and the drama of this story. I mean, I think everyone has had someone in their lives who has struggled with alcohol or even drugs, and it's just so incredibly sad to watch this unfold in front of us. you see that State Queen video where he's speaking in Jamaican patois. He's obviously on something.
He acknowledged that.
He acknowledged he's drinking. I mean, but you look at that, and does that, like, people have questioned, is he on drugs there? And he doesn't really answer. How did he get there? Was he drunk driving? He's hanging out with Sandro Lisi, his former driver / accused drug dealer / the man who's been charged with extortion in connection to the crack video.
I hasten to add, none of this proven in a court of law yet.
All accused. The case is still ongoing.
If the mayor's private life weren't as dramatic as it is, what do you think the verdict on his actual record at City Hall would be?
It's so interesting because they're so tied together. If Rob Ford had stayed the Rob Ford of 2010 and early 2011, he would have a lot of people angry at him. He has a very aggressive, divisive style of politics, but he was being the mayor, and some say he's a bully. I don't know. He was getting his stuff through council. But long before any of this drinking or drug stuff came in, he'd lost control. That was in 2011. By the time, I don't know if you recall, the Portland's fiasco, Doug Ford doing what Doug Ford does, which is hijacking the Ford administration message, said he wants to build a Ferris wheel and a big mall and a monorail. It really embarrassed the administration. They lost control of their budget at that time, and that was when there was this big uprising, and for the first time, the Fords were stopped. They'd been in power for a year and really had no trouble getting their agenda through. And he hasn't really been in control ever since then, and he really doesn't come to City Hall. I know he says otherwise, but the media waits outside his office every morning, and he's not there all that often. He's certainly not in the building very often. We don't know where he is because he won't tell us, and he doesn't send out a schedule.
I knew his dad a little bit. His dad was a MPP in the Mike Harris government, and I got to know him a little bit when he was at Queen's Park. And I know from having spoken to Mayor Ford when he was Councillor Rob Ford, his dad was his hero. He absolutely worshipped his father. And I wonder how much, have you been able to come to a determination as to how much of Mayor Ford's behavior can be laid at the doorstep of his father's premature death?
In the book, I do try to figure out when this started going off the rails. I find evidence of hard drug use back into his 20s, at least cocaine use at the time. Now, was that a consistent thing in his life? I don't know, but I can find evidence of it then. People that I spoke with that were, again, close to the family and close to the mayor himself, say his father's death is really when his partying took a turn and started to really impact his life in a really negative way, impact his family, impact his ability to do his job. And there's no question that Rob Ford's whole life is centered around this idea of trying to please his father, as I think Doug's is in some way. And in the book, I kind of talk about that. So Doug is a couple of years older, the father's a businessman, Doug's kind of going through, they're both growing up. Doug decides to be a businessman and take over the family business. And around that time, Doug Sr. gets into politics and Rob Ford goes into politics. And you can kind of see the two brothers vying for that love of their father.
Gotcha. We got about a minute left here for television, and then we're going to sign off but talk some more for the web after this. So let's just finish up on our television interview with this. Rob Ford said in his victory speech, 2010, "You trusted me and I will live up to your expectations, guaranteed." 3.5 years later, if you were asked to evaluate that sentence, that election night boast, what would you say?
I don't think there's any way you can look at what's happening now and think this is a positive situation for the mayor or for the city.
That sums it up. Robyn Doolittle, the name of the book is called Crazy Town. It's good to meet you. We thank you for coming into TVO tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.